necessarily that something has to have some sort of monetary value or potentially have a monetary value or be able to estimate a value. So you have a business event. And that business event could be as small as selling a can of soda, or it could be a merger or an acquisition or something really big. But a business event, and then the accountant's job is to measure that event, to bring it into the financial statements, so to analyze it, determine the size or value, and to report it. So that there's a record and it can be placed into a system to evaluate multiple business events over an entire period. So they record that in financial statements or usually in a journal, and then the journal is used to create financial statements. We'll talk about what each of the financial statements are, but pretty much look at the balance sheet, the income statement, and the statement of cash flows. They are primary financial statements. And once these are created, then someone who is not working in the company, who's not internal, now has a basis in which to invest or lend or charge taxes often if you're a regulator, and knows what's going on. The idea is that we want to have a system that provides the best and most accurate and timely information to different users. So the users can be the stockholders of the company, wanting to know what's going on with the company that they're invested in. Lenders can also be suppliers and customers. Why do you think a supplier or a customer would be interested in looking at the accounting of their supplier or customer? So why just, for instance, a supplier? Why would a supplier be interested in understanding the financial position of the company? Yep. Absolutely. Just like you said, to make sure he can get his money. So the supplier wants to make sure not only that he's going to be paid, but also wants to have a sense, is this going to be a long-term customer? Is their business really good? Is it growing? Or am I going to need to supply more? So there's a whole relationship there, and they need to understand the business in order to make decisions about increasing production to supply a growing customer, make decisions about offering more credit to their customer if they're a good risk, or maybe taking credit away from them if they think they're a bad risk and they pull credit back and start requiring those tax payments. And what about customers? Why would customers be interested in the economy? So usually the businesses will see supply credit to customers as part of their business. So they're not so much worried about not getting paid like the supplier, but what's the customer worried about? Yep. Yeah. Same thing, in the same way suppliers rely on the business to earn money, customers rely on the business to provide them with goods and services. And so there may be a lot of other companies that can provide the same goods or services, or maybe not. Maybe they have a long-term relationship, and they want to make sure that that long-term relationship is going to continue, that business is viable, and that they'll be able to continue producing the good or service that the customer wants. And then government agencies and regulators, mainly to protect the investing public and more retail investors, also to understand what the business is doing, if there's any kind of regulatory problem, which could be an antitrust problem, say if there was a merger or an acquisition, or just the government needing information to regulate the business. And then we talked a little bit about management accounting. so management accounting is, as I said, a cost accounting or an internal measure of efficiency and profitability. And so this is used essentially by managers internally in order to measure performance, make decisions about allocating capital to different parts of the business. And so it is used by all the way from very top executives down in order to do those two things. Businesses produce an annual report generally, and we're going to look at Starbucks report from last year, and this is where management has the opportunity to not only show the financial statements and footnotes and so on, but also management has an opportunity to kind of sell the business, say how great it is, what the opportunities are, what they expect in terms of growth, what their strategic plans are. So it tells a lot about what's going to happen in the future. It says what have been the challenges or successes in the past. And it also talks a lot about the risks that the business faces. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in the annual report, you have a letter from the management, which is what I was talking about, just an overall, what's the business doing currently. Then you have management discussion and analysis. So management discussion and analysis is the most important thing that you need to read in the annual report, because management discussion and analysis is where, as I said, the business management identifies all the opportunities and things that they think can make the business more successful and grow, but they also list every single thing that could possibly go wrong. So this is primarily a feature, or mainly, I wouldn't say mainly, but definitely a feature of businesses in the U.S. But businesses in the U.S. have to say for each risk area, whether that is product risk, market risk in terms of the market for their goods or services, interest rate risk, foreign exchange risk, regulatory risk, legal risk, all these risks, and it has to go through each of those and say, these bad things could happen. If this happens, this bad thing could happen. So it's very, very negative, very doom and gloom, just very negative. So why do you think management starts off the annual report with this thing like, everything's great and we're doing such a great job, and then right after it says, but all these bad things could happen and they could eliminate our profits, put us out of business, our customers could stop buying, our suppliers could stop supplying, all these things. Why do you suppose they have to put that in there? What purpose does it serve? Do what? Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, usually it's not problems they can't solve or can solve. It's just, well, you can say they can't solve. They're just risks that they can't hedge or manage. So what they're saying is we have these risks. We've done what we can to manage our risk exposure, but we still have these risks. So that's what they're saying. And a lot of this is in there, and it probably if you looked at financial statements 20 or 30 years ago, not so much in there, but at least in the U.S., if you don't put a risk in your MD&A, or management discussion analysis, if you don't say you have a risk and something bad happens and your share price goes down, what happens when your share price goes down, at least in the U.S.? Excuse me? No, I mean, low share prices won't bankrupt you. It certainly brings you closer to that. A little bit, yeah, a little bit that. But really what happens in the U.S. is every time a share price goes down, for whatever reason, a law firm sues that company. It sues the management and said, it went down, we lost money, you have to pay us because you didn't tell us about this risk. And so this is a very, very active thing in the U.S., and I'm not sure about in Europe or elsewhere. I think in other countries, you wouldn't be successful in this, but in the U.S., there's a whole industry of lawyers who simply monitor the stock price, see what happened, and if there's a big loss, they're going to sue and assume it's something that the management didn't tell them about. And a good example of this is, you look at Tesla. You have Elon Musk there, who loves to get on Twitter or do whatever, late at night, and he's always like saying things like, "Oh, we have a buyout firm who wants to pay us, $300 and something for our stock." And then, well, they didn't really have a buyout firm, so they got sued. And that's a more extreme example. But anytime anything bad happens, if it's not in there, then they're not covered. So this is a lot of them covering their liability in case something bad happens, so they won't get sued. That tends to be very negative. All companies that have public shares have to issue a 10K. So that have shares in the public, yeah. Yeah, all companies. Yeah, any market, yeah. It's more or less the same word. The regulator stipulates exactly what goes into the 10K, which, if you look at a lot of annual reports, it's just a little bit at the beginning and then the 10K. They don't even bother to try to, some of them put in lots of pictures, especially if they're a consumer business and happy people using their product. But a lot of them, they just show the 10K with a little bit up, in the front. Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. Excuse me? A 10K is the annual report that the regulator requires. So you have an annual report that may be published, like I said, with lots of photographs of happy people in it. But the government or the regulator, the SEC in the U.S., requires a 10K every year and a 10Q every 3 months. We'll talk about that later, though. Yes. Yes. Right. So identifying potential threats to the business and saying what the possible downside or possible repercussions of those threats can be. Like a loss of sales, a loss of money, a legal loss, just about anything. Yes. So it's not, it used to be more of a general discussion, but now it's almost like a legal disclosure saying, we have this risk, we can have this, and mainly, even if the risk is not that significant, they put it up there just in case something bad happens. If you look at corporate governance, it does, in that, once again, that the management is responsible for doing that in order to protect the firm against lawsuits for them not disclosing any risk that might cause a change in the value of the company. So, and they would probably need to discuss corporate governance issues if those were there in this section, but that would be less common. Yes. Part of it, sorry. Yeah. Ah, no. You mean fair value, and then these. Okay, so and regulators and by U.S. GAAP. Yeah. So and you see this in IFRS also. Well, you see some version. Like I said, in the U.S., it's very long, very legalistic. Outside the U.S., there's still some discussion about risk, but it doesn't tend to be quite so. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get into a long discussion of this, and let us just say that in the U.S., this is very long for protecting legal liability. Other places, it may be very short or almost nothing because that legal liability doesn't exist. Because in most countries, you don't have a whole group of people that make their lives, they're suing companies every time the share price goes down. Because they would say, well, you should have known those risks yourself, or. Anyway, but, the U.S., very highly developed legal system, very aggressive legal system. Okay. Um, Footnotes, also very, very important. So a lot of the real interesting information is down there in the footnotes because the financial statements are something that management has some discretion on in terms of how they report revenues or expenses, but the footnotes are also where many regulators require full disclosure. They say, all right, you don't have to stick it in your income statement or your balance sheet or whatever. You don't have to put it there in the financial statements, but you have to talk about it in detail in the footnotes. And this is where you see talking about any kind of derivative exposure a firm might have and how they're handling it, any kind of changes to the accounting procedure would be in the footnotes, and also I think is another part of this, and also pension liability, all of these more complicated things that require more than a single line, that need a big discussion, and end up in the footnotes. And you'll see if you look at Starbucks annual report or any large corporation's annual report, there's usually about 100 footnotes there, anywhere from 50 to 100 footnotes, and there's a lot of information there that's also important. A lot of financial statement analysis is, knowing which of those you need to look at in order to see if there's a risk or a problem with the business or what's going on. So footnotes, important. Next is the report of the independent auditor. So this is where companies are required to have a third-party independent auditor. And the auditor is somewhat independent, although they are paid by the company. So they have a legal and regulatory responsibility to be independent, but they are paid by the company. And auditors, especially since Sarbanes-Oxley, which we'll talk about a little bit later, a regulation that came into being because the auditors weren't doing their job. And anyway, since then, auditors are independent, but the other thing an auditor will do is when a company has to account for something, the IFRS or U.S. GAAP regulations allow them a certain flexibility. And so one thing an auditor can do, since they're being paid by the company, is to give guidance about you should account for this way. It's perfectly within the rules, and it makes the performance look better. So an auditor technically is not supposed to do that. They're just supposed to look at the books and that. But they would say, oh, your accounting does not seem to be in compliance. If you do it this way, you're in compliance, and maybe there's a benefit. Your performance will look better. So independent auditors management has to sign the financial statements. So it's the CFO and the CEO have to sign it, and they take legal responsibility. So if there's fraud, willful fraud or misrepresentation, they can go to prison for doing that. That's something that was after Sarbanes-Oxley. So you can see the table of contents here for Starbucks. Follows more or less that same format. So it talks about our business, the risk factors, all the properties they own, and so on. And just financial data, and then also talks about compensation. So that's another thing that is required in the U.S. and Europe is talking about the top managers, how much money do they make, how many stock options they get, and just there's transparency in terms of how they're compensated. All right. All right, so we talked about 10Ks, which is the SEC or U.S. government required annual report. And so this is where all the information is stipulated. And as I said, many companies combine their own annual report with the 10K. They just kind of put them together. And the main statements in this are the balance sheet, income statement, and statement of cash flows. All three of those are required. And the government regulator also requires quarterly reports called 10Qs. And so we'll see with Starbucks, because their their year end was September 30th, and they're not going to report their results for 2019 until in November 7th, I believe. And so we're going to look at the annual report from 2018, and then we're going to look at some quarterly reports that they're required to fill out in order to get a sense of, this is what the last annual report said. That if you're an analyst, you need to see what's been going on since then, and then you look at the quarterly reports. And so we'll look at the quarterly reports when we do our financial statement analysis. Yep. Well, I mean, Q is for quarterly, and K is just the name of the. Yes. Oh. So, deadline for this is usually whenever they announce it. So thinking about Starbucks, their year end is September 30th. They need to report this, or they were reporting it 5 weeks later, or 6 weeks later. So there is some deadline. Now, I do not remember exactly if there is a time deadline. I know also if a company borrows money, then the creditors will require that the quarterly reports and annual report be issued within a certain amount of time. And I know an example of a pharmaceutical company, Valiant Pharmaceuticals, had a lot of problems, and their accounts and things were so in bad. They couldn't produce an annual report. They couldn't produce their financial statements, and so they were put into default on their loans because they couldn't produce financial statements. And then their lenders forced them to pay an extra 1% interest per year to take them out of default or to refinance the debt since they were in technical default. So it's a combination of lenders possibly, but I know the regulator probably has a more flexible or gives them more time. But yeah, I'm not aware of an exact limit. I think a general limit would be that you need to do your quarterly report before the next quarter, or your annual report before the next quarter. So maybe within 3 months. It would be a reasonable thing. Then you're supposed to be doing the next one. Okay. Here's Starbucks annual report. And so what we see, we have our assets, our liabilities, and equity this is our balance sheet, and just looking at the top line number or bottom line number here, total assets went from $14 billion in 2017 to about $24 billion in 2018. So we're going to look at why that is. It's pretty unusual for the assets of the company to go up by more than 50%, about 60% in 1 year. So 14 billion to 24 on the assets, and the liabilities also went up. And the liabilities went from just around 9 billion all the way up to 23 billion. A lot of stuff going on with Starbucks. We're going to talk about this on Friday. It's an interesting company because it is, in a way, not that complicated to evaluate, but it's also one that is doing something that is causing these big changes in the balance sheet. And if you look at the retained earnings for Starbucks, also going down from about $5.5 billion to $1.5 billion. Lots of things going on. We'll talk about that later. Okay, questions about that? And then the income statement for Starbucks looks a little more traditional. Because Starbucks, 2 years ago was making a little less than $17 billion. And 17, but more than 17 was 18 billion, and 19, 20 billion in revenue. So Starbucks is a growing company. So, and in terms of its operating income seems to be stable, but then declined a little bit last year. And if we get down to our bottom line number, net earnings typical of Starbucks things look better. So Starbucks 2.8 billion, 2.8, 2.9 billion, and then last year 4.5 billion. So there's lots of things going on there that we'll look at on Friday. Questions about this? So yes. Susan? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we will talk about that, but the reality is that if you have, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, just give me one moment. But, the short answer is that the balance sheet is connected to the next year's balance sheet by an income statement. So the income statement is what connects balance sheets from different periods. And so in this case, we have 3 balance sheets. So balance sheet, income statement, balance sheet, income statement, balance sheet. So we have 3. So in order to, yes. Okay. And so many times and we'll talk about this too, corporations can decide when they want their fiscal year to end. And then the fiscal year end may be moved around because of holidays, so they may not have it on a Sunday or a Saturday or weekend, so they may move it around a bit for that. But within a few days, it's supposed to be more or less at the end of September, beginning of October. So there's a certain amount of flexibility. Now, and the idea is that they're trying to avoid a weekend or a day where there's nobody working. And to some extent, that will introduce possibly a slight variation, but it shouldn't be a big one. It should be no more than a day or so, and it shouldn't make that too big a difference. Yes, and I agree with you. You know that most companies have the same date. Many of them do at the end of the year, so it's always a certain date at the end of the year, which is usually a holiday or maybe not a holiday. You know. So suffice it to say that the rules allow Starbucks a little bit of variation here on exactly what date that they're producing their statement. And so, as I said, it's only a day or two variation, so the variability should not be high. But obviously, if this was not permitted, then they wouldn't do it. I mean, they're a huge corporation. So, yeah. But you're right. I normally, mostly whether it's a holiday or a weekend or whatever, that's the end of the year. And they just figure it out.